Hello everyone, and welcome to this presentation of a geometry nodes thing I've created in Blender that lets you create game-ready hair. So I've gotten a few questions about how to create fur and fur textures and meshes and things like that you can export to a game engine. And this is a geometry nodes network that will do that. And as you can see, this is very complicated. So I was originally thinking of making a video on putting this thing together, but as you can see, this thing is a bit of a beast. So instead, I'm going to upload this to my GitHub page and probably also Blender Market and Gumroad, so you can get it from there. And the rest of this video, I'm just going to be walking through all the different things that you can do to set up hair. Set up fur, specifically short hair, and also things like short haircuts and beards, so that you can get an effect like this on your own game models and then export them to your favorite game engine. To download the file, come over here to my GitHub page and click on the Releases section, and then download the latest release. Once you've done that, you're going to want to go back into Blender and set up your assets folder. So take that zip file that you downloaded, unzip it into a folder, and then what you're going to want to do is come over here to Edit and Preferences, and then make sure that you have File Paths clicked over here. Go down to the bottom, and you can set up the paths for your file assets so that the file asset browser can find them. You can see the last entry here. This is the folder where everything is downloaded and installed at the moment. And then I just changed the name to Fur Tools so that it's clearly labeled in the asset browser. Once you've done all that, then you can just open up the asset browser window by coming up here and clicking on Asset Browser. And now you have all of those tools, the fur shader and the fur cards with cage, ready to go and ready to use in your project. All right, now that we've got our asset browser all set up, let's start putting fur on this character. Now here's a simple character I made a little bit ago. It's just a mesh bound to a rig, a Rigify rig. And if you come over here, we can look at the shader we've got attached to it. You can see it's just a basic principled BSDF shader with a texture map on it. So nothing complicated at all. So now we are going to get this all set up for fur. So let's hide that camera and let's hide the bones in the viewport. And the first thing we're going to do is unbind this from our armature because we're not going to need that for this demonstration. And so there's a body mesh. The first thing we're going to do is duplicate that by pressing Shift-D, tab into edit mode, select everything, and then Alt-S to scale that up slightly. So I just made that a little bit bulgier than our basic body mesh. I'm going to rename this to body cage. And we're going to go down to the viewport, and we're going to change this from textured to wire. So if we go back into object mode, you can see there is our body underneath it, and we now have this wire frame on top of it. And what we're setting up here is the start and end points of our hairs. We're going to have the hairs go from the body to the cage, and we're going to match up the place where it erupts from the body to the place where it hits the cage. And then by dragging the points of the cage around, we can affect how long the hair is. But in order to do that, we need one more thing. We're going to add a new piece of geometry. Does not matter which one of these meshes you select, so I'm just going to pick something with not too many vertices. And let's rename this fur, because we're going to be turning this into fur very shortly. Now let's go over to geometry nodes, and you can see I've already set this viewport to the asset browser. Normally this would be in spreadsheet view, but we're going to switch over to the asset browser, and here is the file I had you download that has the geometry nodes in it. And here is the shader we're going to use to shade the fur. Let's start off with that. We're just going to drag this directly onto the cube here. So you can see it is now using that shader. And this is more just to sort of bring it into the file here. Anyhow, let's go into shaded mode there. Okay, now let's click over here onto the modifiers, and let's click over here to add a new geometry nodes to it. Now, this is the nodes right here. So to get started, let's just drag and drop that over here. And let's put that up there. And right away, you can see that this has connected the geometry here to the geometry group output there. And if that isn't connected, you can just sort of connect it manually by drag and dropping between the two of them there. Now, in order to make this a little bit easier to use, at least my own personal preferences, we're going to try to bring all these parameters over into the properties editor over there. Now, you could leave them over here and edit them here because they're exactly the same as what you're going to find over here. But I just find it a little bit easier to come down and click on the fur cards with cage. And now all of those options are now appearing over here on the geometry node. So you can do whichever style you wish or find more convenient. All right, now that we have the geometry nodes on our former cube object, let's come back up here to view layer. We're going to start filling in these options so that we can actually see the fur on the body here. So the first thing we're going to need to change is body mesh. Change that to body. That's just the name of the underlying character. And cage mesh, that's going to be body cage, which is the cage shape that we just created. And the UV map, let's click on the little flag here. And then we're going to set that to UV map, which is the name of the UV map of the cage. And if we click on the body cage and come over down here into the vertex groups, and you click on UV maps, this is just the name of the default UV map that is written right here. If you've changed your name to something else, you're going to want to change it to match this. But by default, UV map should be what you want to go for. Let's click back on the geometry nodes. Okay, and let's see, the fur color, this is going to be body albedo, which is just the texture image that we are is for our base model here. You can set it to something else if you want, but I think most of the time you're going to want it to be exactly the same as whatever the texture image is used to paint the body. And let's see, and material. Finally, we're going to set that to fur shader, which is just the shader that we dragged onto the cube earlier. Now you can start to see the cards here. One more thing, we're going to need to click on output attributes. We're going to type in fur color here, and we're going to type in fur UV. And you can see here, this has now given us the basic hair cards all over the model. And I'm going to hide the body cage for a second so that you can see this a little bit more clearly. And let's also hide those bones because they're a little bit distracting. Okay, we're going to clean this up and make it look a little bit nicer a little bit later. For now, I'm just going to explain what's going on here. The fur color and the fur UV. At the moment, Blender requires you to name your attributes. So you can see at the all of the nodes in this node network eventually boil down to these three outputs here. You have the geometry, which comes out and is the actual hair cards themselves. The fur color, which comes out and is the color of each hair, and the fur UV, which are the UVs for each one of these hair cards. I then have to give them a name. To keep things simple, I'm just giving it the exact same name as the output attribute. And the reason why we're doing that is if we come over here to the shader, you can see we're using those same names here as inputs. So the color named fur color comes in here. So it goes into our shading network, and the UV named fur UV comes in here. So it also comes into that part of our shading network. This is the way Blender hooks all these things up right now by using names. I think in the future they're going to simplify this a bit so it won't be necessary to do this step. But for now, it is, whoops, back to geometry nodes. For now, it's necessary to make sure that the outputs over here actually end up in the shader. Okay, so that is the necessary stuff to get all set up and drawing the basic geometry. Let us now go to the more fun bit. Go over here. Oh, and you have to be in one of these two modes in order to actually have the shaders do the shading job properly. If you're over here in texture shaded, you're not going to see anything. So back into the modifiers tab. Let's see the density. Let's change the card width first. This is just how wide these individual strands of fur are. So let's narrow that up. And that just controls the left and right width. Actually, let me show you what's going on with the cage. Let's bring that back up. So the reason why we have the cage here, let's go into edit mode. And now if we select, actually let's select one over top of a hair. If we select this and pull it out, you can see that the hair follows, oops, wrong vertex, follows the edge of the cage. So it's going to be doing its best to find the corresponding point on the cage, and then the end of the hair is going to be pulled towards that point on the cage. And when you have a lot of hairs, this can create a nice smooth fur effect. So I'm just going to undo all this. Cage back to where it was. All right. Click back on the fur. And all right, so that's the card width. The density controls how many of these things there are. So let's put that up to 400. So that's more, not quite enough. Let's put that at 4,000. See, it's a lot more dense now. Let's hide the cage again for a second. So again, a lot more hairs. Let's crank that up. Let's crank that up to 8,000. All right, so that's a lot of hair. And let's see. I think at this point, playing with the cage is going to make a little bit more sense. Let's turn the cage back on. So if we want to pull that out, and let's go into proportionate editing up there. And let's actually make that a little bit bigger. There we go. Yeah, that was much too small earlier. And let's pull out the cheeks a bit. Can even puff up the chest a bit. And you don't have to pull it out wide like this. You can do much smaller ones too. Let's reduce the radius there. And just by pushing and pulling these points in, you can sort of shape and sculpt the hair. And you don't have to pull it out. You can also pull it down too, which will give you a nice sort of smoothing effect here. And fur works best when you view it from the side. You can see that when you're viewing it directly on, you're seeing a lot of the base mesh underneath. One way to hide that is to just pull the cage a little bit to make this hair a little bit longer and brushed in a certain direction. But the other thing you can do is just make the underlying base mesh have a fur painted on texture. That way, when you're viewing it straight on like this, you're seeing the painted on fur texture, but when you're viewing the edges and viewing it from the angle, you see the hair cards, which gives you the furry effect. And I also have the X mirror on here just to give us some symmetry. That's the basic idea. So you're going to be just pulling the cage around to pull out hair, to pull out fur to make it longer, and to give it a little bit of direction. And let's turn off the cage again. And you can start to see the fur effect in the places where I've pulled it out. Now, let me go into a little bit more detail on some of the other parameters here. So we've covered card width and density. In fact, we could even, let's click off there. In fact, we could even turn up the card width a little bit more to make the fur a little bit thicker. See, 2.3, that seems to be working well. Let's see, so hair tilt randomness. This controls how much sway you have in the hair. So if we put that down to 0, you can see that the fur becomes all very straight and all very parallel, which can give you a neat sort of velvet look, but which is kind of unrealistic. By increasing the tilt, you can see that that hair is tilting a little bit more to the side, and if you put that all the way up to 1, then the tilt is completely random, and you have these hairpins coming out at every single angle, which will give you a more of a chunky tufted look. So it looks like they've probably not had a bath in a while, but could be the sort of effect you're looking for. Let's put that back down to 0.5, which is right in the middle. And let's see, you have the bend amount, which gives you a little bit of a bend to the fur. So let's get the cage back again. So let's really pull that out. And back to the fur. So if we oops, I should have put a minimum on that. Let's see, let's put that back down to, let's put that at 0.5. So you can see that this is now causing the fur to bend a little bit. It's actually a little bit easier to see this on the monkey, but it gives it a little bit of an arc. This is supposed to go from 0 on up. Let's give it 0.2 to give it a little bit less of a curve. But yeah, this is sort of a way to sort of hook the fur to make it look a little bit more wavy and a little bit less straight. Let's see, next thing is fur card facets. That's just the number of faces you have per fur card. Let's go back into that mode so you can sort of see the geometry. I'm going to come down here and turn on wireframe. This is just going to show you the actual faces. So if you see too much fur, it's hard to tell what's going on. But you can see on each one of these strands sticking out, there's a whole lot of faces. Let's click on that again. And if you change the number of facets, that's just going to give you more divisions for a face. I think 4 makes sense. If you really care about not upping the poly count too much, you might want to put that down to 2 or even 1. But it's sort of a personal preference there, just what works for your game and what you think looks aesthetically pleasing. Let's switch that back on. Oh, and let's turn off wireframe. So there's sort of a chunkier hair look. And let's turn off the cage again. Yeah, let's put the facets back up again. Just get a little bit more smoothing in there. Let's see, the body albedo, yeah, that's just the color. The texture map we're using to color the fur. And the cutoff length, this is more a way to deal with errors. Sometimes these fur patches will erupt at a point on the body which is exactly on a UV boundary. When that happens, that can cause an error. And if I turn that to 100, for example, you can see there's this one stray hair going from the ankle to the hand, which shouldn't be there. What this does is it just says that any hair that is longer than this is obviously some sort of an error, and just if you ever come across a hair that's that long, just forget about it. So by default, I put this at 1 meter. Figure any hair strand that's 1 meter, for a fur strand that's 1 meter or longer long, probably an error. And that deals with that one stray fur strand there. And okay, and yeah, that's it. The rest of these are just the basic stuff, the basic inputs you need to make it all work. Oh, one more thing, the fur mask. I completely forgot about that. So our guy here is starting to look a little bit fuzzy. You might want to have some parts of the body where there is no fur at all, like maybe the facial area, maybe the hands or the palms of the hand, maybe the bottoms of the feet, or inside the mouth. So the fur mask allows us to erase those areas so that there's no fur there. So let's click on our body, and let's go over here to weight paint mode. And let's click down here on the vertex groups. And we're going to come down here to the vertex groups. We're going to click plus. And we're going to rename this to fur mask. And now that we have that, we're just going to paint where we do not want to have fur. Now, I wasn't quite sure whether I should set this up so that painting gave you fur or took away fur, but since I figured that the majority of what's going to be on your model is fur, probably makes more sense for the blue to be where the fur is rather than where the fur isn't. So let's just paint these weights, and you can see that as I go around here, it's taking away the fur wherever it is red, and it's also becoming less dense wherever it is yellow or green. It's not taking away completely in those areas, but it is reducing it. So you might find that useful if you have a model that has some areas with more fur and other areas with less fur. I'm not going to spend too long doing this. I'm just going to erase some of the fur just to sort of give you the general idea of what's going on here. Okay, and let's go back into object mode. And there you can see that we've gotten rid of the fur in the face area, so it's a lot easier to see out. So, and once again, Blender cares about names a lot, so make sure that fur mask down here, and case is important, make sure that fur mask here matches the fur mask in the density mask up here. One more thing before we move on to exporting. Let's select the fur and come over here to shaders. Just want to show you where we are getting the actual texture for the fur itself. It's down here underneath the fur tuft node. This is just regular texture node coming in, and if we go over here to texture paint, this is what it looks like, just a black and white image showing where all the different hairs go. Okay, and if you want to change that, you can just go into the shader. That is shading tab, there we go. And just change it here to whatever image texture you want it to be. All right, so back over here. Now we've generated our mesh. Now we want to bake this into something that we can export to a game engine. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to select our fur, press Shift-D to duplicate. Here we go. And I just right-click there to cancel the transform. And I'm just making this just to make a backup, because if we make a mistake, we still have our original fur mesh here. We can always make another duplicate of it. But we're making the copy so that we can turn this into an actual mesh. Now, when we select this option, this is going to get rid of the original cube geometry, get rid of the geometry nodes, and bake it all down to our final mesh. So if we go over to the Geometry Nodes tab, we see there is now no geometry nodes on this mesh anymore. It's all just regular polygons. And at this point, we need to do something else. Let's come down here to the vertex groups. And you'll notice that there is no UV map here. This is a limitation in the current version of Blender. Even though the geometry node did output a color, and let's go down to the bottom here. Even though it did output a color and a UV map, or a few fur UVs down here, and it stored the color output in the color attributes, it did not store the UVs in the UVs. No problem, we can do that manually by clicking on fur UV there, clicking this down arrow, convert attribute, and make sure this is set to UV map, and click OK. And now all those fur UVs have been transferred up here into the UV map section. Hopefully that is going to go away in future versions of Blender. So just take a look here to see whether or not the UV map was created, and if not, you can transfer it up there that way. All right, so we have our mesh with the right geometry, the color map, and the UV map. Let us get this rigged, attached back to our rig again, because we want the fur to move with the model if we move the model. So let's see, we're in layout. Let's turn our bones back on. And remember at the start of the video, we detached the body from the rig. Let's turn off our new fur for a second. Let's select the body. Let's select the armature, Control P, and with automatic weights. And let's turn our export fur back on. And if we go into pose mode, you will notice that we can move the body, but the fur does not come with it. Just sort of hanging there in space. We don't want that. What we want to do is attach the fur to the rig as well. Now, if you might think of doing this by, let's go back into object mode. You might think of doing this by selecting the fur and then selecting the rig and then doing the same thing again. Whoops, Control P, not Alt P. Control P, there we go. If you do it this way, you're going to get an error because our mesh has many overlapping polygons that are not connected with each other, and that really does not go well with the with how automatic mapping works. And you might have seen the warning there, it just went away. Anyway, the short of it is that we failed to connect our fur to our armature that way. So we're going to use a different method. We're going to select the body, and then we're going to select the fur, and make sure that you're in the bind pose like this so that your fur matches the body, or the fur is very close to the part of the body it's supposed to be attached to. We're going to come over here to weight paint mode, and we're going to go to weights and transfer weights. And this is going to transfer the weights we just baked onto the body mesh, onto the fur mesh. And yeah, make sure this is by name and all layers. By default, I think that comes out as active layer. You want this to be by name instead and all layers. So, and now if we go back to object mode, we'll see if we move our rig again. Now the fur comes with it. And let's turn the bones off again. Okay, and now we're just ready to export. Okay, one more time with the bones. Select everything. Let's clear the transform. Okay, and at this point, you can export it just the way you export a regular mesh. We'll just click the rig there and file export. Let's export as a GLTF, or you can choose whichever format is useful to you. And that should be ready for our game engine to import. All right, now we're ready to bring our model into our game engine. I'm going to be demonstrating this in the Godot game engine, but you can use whichever game engine you're using. The process should be similar. And you can see I've already started off. I've created a scene with a few lights in it, just so we can see what's going on. And I'm going to bring in our model, which is called FurTest08, into our scene. And let's adjust the transform so that that is near the center. And right away, we can see the mesh that we exported for our fur is here, but there's no shader on it, or at least the shader is messed up. So what we're going to do is create our own fur shader in our game engine. First, we're going to right-click here and click Editable Children. Then we're going to click on the fur mesh. This is the mesh of the actual hair cards itself. We're going to go over here to Material, Empty, New Shader Material. Click on there and go into Shader, New Visual Shader. And we're going to click on that, and now we can start editing our visual shader. The first thing we're going to do is open the Modes panel there. And as we move around our model, you might notice the hairs are sort of fading and in and out of existence. That's because backface culling is on, and whenever we see the back of a fur card, the engine is just deleting it. So by changing this to disabled, then you get to see both sides of the card, front and back. Next, what we're going to do is bring in the color. We did export our model with vertex colors, but we cannot see it just now because our shader is not using them. let's right click in the window down here, go to Input, Fragment, Color, and this is the node that brings in our vertex colors. So we're just going to plug that into albedo, and you can see the red part of our fur now has that red color on it. Now you might notice also that these are also blocky cards. So let's bring in our texture. So this is our fur tuft texture. As you can see here, it's just a black and white image. There's no alpha on it, but we are going to be using the black and white as the alpha channel. So let's connect RGB to alpha. And right away you can see those tufts of fur on the model. Now you might also see it looks a little bit see-through right there, so we're going to fix that by adding in a scissor test. We're going to right-click. This time we're going to come down to Scalar and down to Variables. And the reason why we're picking from this area is when you create a uniform from this section, this is something that the user can edit later. So you don't have to open up the shader, go into this big graph and do the shader programming. This is just going to appear on the outside of the shader so that artists, game modelers, whoever, can change this a little bit more easily if they need to. Anyhow, in order to indicate that we want this to be an alpha scissor test rather than an alpha blend, we're just going to connect this over here to the alpha scissor area. And we are going to turn that on. And the default value, let's set that at 0.5. And now you can see what it's doing is it's taking a look at our texture. Wherever this value is greater than 0.5, it is drawing the hair, and wherever it is less than 0.5, it is just not drawing it in the first place. So 0.5 is a little bit strong. Let's bring this down to 0.3. That's a bit better. Let's try 0.1. And notice the hair is getting a little bit thicker as I change this. So there, at this point, we're using a 1% or 0.1 as the cutoff, which gives us a nice, fairly thick hair. Okay, and well, let's also change the name of this to Alpha Scissor so that our users who are playing with the shader later can edit this if they want to. One last thing, you might notice our fur is looking a little bit dark. That's because fur has a transmission factor. If you can imagine like a leaf, if you hold a leaf up to the sun, you're going to see some of the sunlight filtering through the leaf, and you're able to see that on the backside. Well, it's the same thing with fur. Fur has a transmission that you can sort of see through it, or you can see the light shining through it as well. So we're going to cut and Control-C, Control-V, cut and paste this node here. Let's call this transmission. And let's drag this into the transmission factor right there. And you can see right away that fur lightened up a little bit. We can put this up to make it a little bit lighter. You don't want to make it too high because then your fur starts to glow. But let's put that at 0.1. And there is your fur shader. Now you have your fur on your model and it is being rendered as polygons. And if we come out, we can go down to our animation player and start playing that. And our fur goes right along with our model. And if we want to tweak this, like this fur is looking a little bit dark, let's click back on fur over here and click on here. And instead of going to the visual shader, we can just adjust the shader parameters here because that transmission and alpha scissor scalar that we added, well, you can now see them exposed right here. So let's turn up the transmission to 0.2, make that 0.4. There we go. And now we have an animated fur-covered model in our scene. So I hope you found this useful. I know it's a complicated process, but fur is a complicated thing to export. There's lots of stuff you can adjust and tweak on this, but these are the broad strokes. Like I said, I'm going to be posting that plugin on my website. You can download it there. And I hope you found this useful and you are able to create fur for your own models in your own projects. Thanks for watching.